Welcome to the World Bank Praxis discussion series. I'm Auskar Surbakti. I'd like to welcome our audience here in Sydney, those watching on APAC online and listening in on radio, and everyone watching in Honiara, Dili, Port Moresby and Jakarta. More than 1 billion people live in poverty. At the same time, inequality is rising in many emerging economies. Economic inequality is said to impact social cohesion, hamper efforts to reduce poverty, and limit economic growth, which can lead to enclaves of social exclusion. Resource-rich countries like Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands have experienced some of the highest growth rates in the world, yet groups of people risk falling behind. What drives inequality and does it undermine development? And how can countries really achieve greater social inclusion? To discuss these issues and more, we're joined by Lars Osberg, lecturer in economics at Dalhousie University in Canada, Michelle Rooney, PhD candidate at the Australian National University's State, Society and Governance Melanesia program, Virginia Horscroft, senior economist at the World Bank, and Sameer Dossani, international head of advocacy at ActionAid. Thank you all for joining us. Firstly, if we could just open up and establish the topic. Sameer, why is equality an important question for development?
Well, we're living in a world, according to World Bank statistics, where 1% of the world's population controls 40% of the world's wealth, where the top 10% control over 80% of the world's wealth. At the same time, you have hungry people all over the world. You have close to 1 billion people, more than 850 million people, who are living in danger of not meeting their daily nutritional needs. So to have this kind of disparities, to have this kind of wealth inequalities, it stops becoming an economic or even a political issue. I would say it's a moral issue. That to have this much wealth when there's this much poverty in the world is actually a moral wrong. There's stuff that can be done about it, of course, which is that, companies, by our estimates, corporations are avoiding or through a series of incentives and avoidance schemes are avoiding about $300 billion in tax every year. That's more than most estimates think would be needed to meet the Millennium Development Goals this year, right? To meet all of the poverty targets and so on. So if we actually just fix one part of the problem, which is tax avoidance and bad incentive deals by corporates, we could actually do a lot to address this question of inequality.
So we've had a comment come in on Twitter recently saying that development would not be fully met if certain sectors of the society don't feel improvement in their living conditions. So I guess this is a question of GDP or macroeconomic growth versus the reality on the ground. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when we look at the economic growth figures, we can say, yes, a country is growing, but what about other indicators? And you have, the UNDP has its Human Development Index, which captures some of these other indicators. There are other indices which are also being used. But one indicator that I like to use is really just employment. It's very simple. When I talk to, if I talk to someone on the streets who maybe, I live in India, in Delhi, I talk to someone who may be sweeping the streets, and I asked what their parents did. I often found that their parents actually they weren't maybe making as much money, maybe they were in the villages or whatever, but they had a more, shall I say, dignified existence, shall I say. They had access to basic services, they had access to certain things. The children are actually in worse living circumstances than the parents. And that could be okay for a generation. Maybe a generation has to make a sacrifice. But one would hope that the next generation is not, again, sweeping streets or not being poor in the villages, is taking a step up, right? So you hope that more jobs are being created and better jobs are being created. And in too many countries, that's not the case. And that's not an indicator that we keep track of very much.
Lars, is there evidence to suggest that inequality undermines growth and development?
Well, I think the very difference between countries is in itself an aspect of inequality. It's the international inequality that we've inherited from centuries past. And if we think about what we're going to bequeath to our children and our grandchildren. The question is whether we want to similarly bequeath a world of great inequality and stunted options for most of humanity. The connection between the two, of course, comes most obviously, in terms of resource extraction and who gets the benefits from resource extraction. So I'd just like to pick up on that really important point, that the taxation revenue that countries either don't get or could get but waste is just huge as a determinant of the social wage that those countries can provide to their citizens.
Okay, and we'll come to those problems with policy later on. But Michelle, your studies specialise in Melanesian countries. How does it manifest itself in Papua New Guinea, this inequality and poverty?
Yeah, well, I think in Papua New Guinea, you've got a country that's resource rich and in the past few years has had a very strong and growing economy. But this masks increasing level of inequality within the country. I've got figures that are quite old because there's not more recent data on hand, but figures such as 10% of the population accounting for 36% of consumption, while the poorest 50% of the population only account for 20% of consumption. And I think there's enough anecdotal, and you can see it on the ground, that these inequalities are increasing despite very strong economic growth. And also in Papua New Guinea, you've also got pockets of spatial inequality, where there's areas that have just got an environmentally tougher, ecologically tougher places to develop. So they've experienced, studies have shown that there's pockets in Papua New Guinea that have shown over 40 years very, very high levels of disadvantage compared to the rest of the country, and those places continue to get marginalized. And then you've got social inequalities such as gender and children, vulnerable people. So I think Papua New Guinea is a case where you've got very strong growing economy but increasing inequality.
Ginny, is this a problem in the wider Pacific? Because there is a perception that perhaps poverty and inequality isn't that much of a problem in the Pacific versus, say, countries in Southeast Asia, because while people may lead simpler lifestyles, they're not technically impoverished. Is this a problem in the wider Pacific region?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that probably depends on what you're actually focusing on specifically. So unlike in Papua New Guinea, food poverty is not widespread in the rest of the Pacific, so probably less than 5% in most of the countries. But that doesn't mean that hardship isn't prevalent. Depending on the country, it's probably somewhere between 15 and 40% of people living in hardship in the other Pacific islands. So that's a substantial proportion of the population. Now, how the lines are drawn and so on varies between the countries, but this is still this significant hardship, and inequality is a problem. Maybe not extreme by global standards, but if inequality is a problem in Southeast Asia, then it's equally a problem in the Pacific Islands, because the most unequal societies in the Pacific have inequality about the same as China, Malaysia, Philippines in Southeast Asia, and that the less unequal societies in the Pacific are more like Cambodia, Laos. So the parallels are very clear that to the extent that we think it's a problem in Southeast Asia, it's also a problem in the Pacific.
And let's look at a country like the United States, because I've got a quote here from Bill Gross, who's the manager of the world's largest bond fund at PIMCO. He recently said that he believes increases in inequality has made the United States less productive. Do you agree with that?
Well, what we've seen in the United States over the last 30 years is a situation where the vast mass of the population, people at the bottom are just, if anything, absolutely worse off. People at the middle are very small changes, if anything. People even in the upper middle class is flat in terms of real income for like 30 years. But at the top, just escalating up in ways that are truly dramatic. And I think this creates enormous problems for that society and by extension for the world economy, because it creates interacting instabilities, both economic and political, which are just unsustainable in the long term. So it's really something dangerous for the world economy, as well as for the United States by itself.
Before we move on, what about this idea of forms of inequality being good for growth and development? For example, incentivizing entrepreneurship and investment. Is that true?
Well, there's always been some level of inequality in all societies, as I've said. But the question is whether you're getting just massive amounts of inequality, which are well beyond any conceivable social purpose. In rich countries, you've seen a lot of inequality over the years, but you've also seen an attempt by government to build that infrastructure of public education, of health care, of housing and social services, which guarantee a minimally reasonable sort of life for the vast mass of the population. And so in that sense, the crucial issue is just what do you tax and spend? Do you in fact make some of that income recycle back to benefit society as a whole?
Sameer, I saw you nodding there. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with what Lars has said, but I think we have to go a little bit deeper and say, I think underlying the question that you asked is this idea of this sort of perfect state of free market capitalism that exists in some ideal. This doesn't exist, and we have to be very real. All existing capitalist countries have regulations, have markets, have governments that prop up some industries and don't favor others, right? It's absolutely how it works in 100% of the cases. So the question is, there's a couple of questions here. One is that this unregulated view of capitalism has in many ways been pushed by institutions like the WTO, like the IMF, like the World Bank, for, I won't necessarily say at the current moment, but at least for the 25 years starting in 1980. So the harm that's been done by unfettered privatization policies without proper regulation, the harm that's been done by focusing on trade liberalization as opposed to the question of, okay, what industries do you want to build? What's your development strategy? And based on your development strategy, well, then we can talk about what your liberalization strategy may look like. These questions, the question of what kind of redress needs to be made for those wrongs. These were wrongs that were committed due to debt crises and so on that we can talk about if there's time. But the question of redress for this is a very real question, number one. The question number two is, and this is getting back to the myth of sort of free market capitalism. Look, every country, whether it's the US, whether it's Tanzania, whether it's Burma, whether it's India, every country is going to have, whether it's the Solomon Islands, every country has to have its own development strategy. And if you are over-reliant on raw materials, if you're over-reliant on unprocessed goods, if you're over-reliant on export of those unprocessed goods, it's not going to be a very successful development strategy. So how do you achieve economic transformation away from the raw materials towards some kind of finished goods, towards some kind of industrialization? We can talk about green industrialization, we can talk about something else, and even services as another component of that as well. So how do we, the question for every country should really be, how do we achieve this with a balance of free market and controlled policies?
Ginny, was there anything in what Sameer had to say that sparked your interest, or anything that you agreed or disagreed with?
Well, I think that the point that he's making that none of the policies should be ends in themselves. The idea is not to privatise or to liberalise, or the idea is to develop. The idea is to have people better off now, this generation, than they were previously, and that should be the focus. So if we think about the Pacific, and you think about privatisation in the Pacific, in a lot of instances you have a very small market. You might, for a public enterprise, have a public monopoly. I don't think we would think that it's a great thing to replace that with a private monopoly, which perhaps has more potential to impoverish people than a public monopoly. Think about questions of capacity to regulate and so on. So I think the issue is right, that the question is not pursuing things because ideologically people might be wedded to them, or any other reason. That the idea is what will contribute to development, in particular what will contribute to development of the least well off, of the bottom 40%.
Michelle, let's look at Papua New Guinea for a moment. As you mentioned, the country has undergone massive growth in recent years thanks to its resources. But why do you think a lot of people are missing out, as you say?
Very good question. I think there's a lot to do with, when you talk about poverty and inequality, it's about, apart from the numbers, is the access to services and opportunities. And I think as inequality increases, many people find themselves marginalized from accessing basic health services, education services. We also have increasing, so for example, in urban areas where you have accommodation issues, the economic boom has resulted in really high rentals in the urban centers in places like Papua New Guinea, which means a lot of people find themselves not affording accommodation and shifting into informal settlements, which again creates a population group that is marginal and vulnerable again, because they're viewed by society as illegal or informal, and that sort of further deepens marginalized people. So I think there's a number of factors which cause this, but mainly because there's lack of opportunity and opportunities aren't created. Another example is on the ground. You keep hearing about this resources boom, but there are so many young people who are just not getting employment. So something's not happening between that high level macroeconomic progress and what's happening to people's lives.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because that's a problem that's also present in Western Australia and with the mining boom happening over there. But Sameer, if we could look at other countries, is this a common theme for developing countries who are met with great resources?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if we look at Nigeria, is the classic case that is given. There is this term, which I'm sure many people will be familiar with, the resource curse. The idea of the resource curse is not just that countries in which the resources are located don't benefit, because in fact some people in the countries do, especially elites tend to. But the idea is that the actual communities, so in the case of Nigeria, we talk about the Ogoni communities and others in the Niger Delta. There are many, many other examples across the world. Even indigenous peoples in Canada, maybe another example during the whole tar sands boom that we have right now. So the idea is the actual communities that live on top of the resources are actually the people who are the most devastated, as it were, by the. And one way to address this that has come up is to really have solid taxation policies. Is to say, okay, if this company is going to come in, it's an international company. In the case of Nigeria, they're not even refining. The oil is not even being refined in Nigeria. Right? They tried to do it at a certain point in their history. They gave up on that. So all of it is being exported as crude oil, and is being whatever value is being added to the crude oil is being added outside of the country. So it's not coming to Nigerians. And I think one way to address this would be to have extremely high tax rates. So one country that has actually done this well is Botswana, that has taxed things like the diamond trade. It taxes the diamonds at more than 40%, close to 50% it used to. I think it's recently reduced some of its tariffs. But the point being that then Botswana is the only country in sub-Saharan Africa that has been able to manage the HIV/AIDS crisis in a very good way, that has been able to invest in education, that has been able to invest in certain development outcomes, and in which you see employment starting to pick up, right? And it was touted even 10 years ago, it was touted as the development success story in that part of the world, right? So the point being that there are ways to handle this, but some of the recipes, taxing oil at 50%, for example, it may be very popular with Nigerians. It will be fairly popular with Nigerians, but it's not going to be very popular with the international community, especially with companies or with in the countries such as the Netherlands, such as the UK, such as the US, in which those companies are based. So we really need to say, okay, is the needs of these companies, is that really what's going to define our development policy? Or is development policy going to be defined by democratic processes within the countries?
You've used the term GDP fetishism before, suggesting that we're focusing too much on using GDP as an indicator rather than quality of life. What are the alternatives in measuring well-being?
Well, let's come back to this issue of resource extraction for an example, because GDP tries to measure the total amount of marketed goods and services produced in a country at a point in time. But if we think about resource extraction, the question is who benefits from resource extraction and how? If a mining company comes into a country and digs up an ore deposit that was there forever and didn't benefit anybody at all, but they bring all their machinery and most of their senior labor and only hire a few people locally and then export all the profits. Well, of course, that economic activity, all that machinery purchase and all that payment of expatriates and the few local people that are employed, that all goes into GDP, right? So it's a statistical picture of economic activity, but the actual local benefits going to people are just the few local people who are directly employed. That they're often quite visible, so it gives the impression of a boom. But most of the money is actually going out. Now, but it doesn't actually stop there, because in a sense that's an opportunity, because you could tax that economic activity. If you taxed it, then that would produce revenues for local governments, could go for healthcare, could go for education, could go for any number of purposes, and could have a major impact on inequality and poverty. So in that sense, it's an opportunity often missed in practice, whether from corruption or for political pressure from developed countries. But GDP in that sense measures the possibility. It doesn't measure the actuality of benefits to the local population. And so to focus on it as the key output measure is in that sense a fetish, something that really doesn't benefit local people.
Ginny, do you think this is a good idea? From looking at the Pacific, from your work in the Pacific, do you think that's
focusing
right
on inequality as well as focusing on growth? Absolutely. And I mean, if we think about it, if we don't know how growth is being distributed, then we don't know anything about how it's affecting the least well-off. And that is the focus of what we're doing in the development field. So of course we should focus on inequality as well as on growth.
Okay, Michelle, if we could again look at PNG and how this development has affected traditional systems, for example, the Wontok system. Firstly, can you just explain what that is for those of us who don't know and how that's being affected by the development there?
Well, probably PNG and the Pacific at large generally regarded as gift economies, which means you have cultural exchange between families, between individuals and clans, and these involve reciprocity, obligation, and historical, and they tie families together. A part of it is ceremonial, so it happens, you might have heard of the word bride price, where it's bride wealth during marriage, or mortuary payments and ceremonies, births or whatever. And quite an important part of it in contemporary society is to do with paying for school fees for people, remitting funds. You hear a lot of Pacific Islands remit funds back home. And down to another level is basic safety nets for society. So you've got, the Wontok system is actually a complex concept that can't just be easily explained, but it has these tiers and dynamics within it. And the part that I've been interested in is that part of which is the safety net system. And I think in a place like Papua New Guinea, with increasing pressures to have cash incomes to pay for just a livelihood, I think many families are faced with really serious choices in life as to whether they continue to participate in this extended family, which many people are obliged to and have to be part of, or do they sort of start cutting down on that and focusing a little bit more on their immediate family. And I think my experience is that people face these dilemmas, and as you mentioned earlier, these are moral issues that societies are going through, which means that some of these traditional systems are going through quite significant transformation. And so having said that, in the policy arena, you hear people say, traditional safety nets are now breaking down, and I think that's where some of these issues come out. And I just add on to that is that the dilemmas people face, I think, they're caught between sort of a rock and a hard place. You don't have a lot of formal insurance in developing countries, so if by participating in the extended family system in these cultural events or through supporting other families, that's a form of insurance. So when things go wrong for you, you then count on your family members to support you back. And at the same time, by continuing to support, you're also diminishing your own capacity to look after yourself. So I think these are big, serious dilemmas that from a development perspective, we need to sort of take that debate further and try to understand a bit more what's happening within society.
Also, where this becomes very important is that the development process itself changes the extent to which traditional social safety nets can cope, because it changes the nature of people's livelihoods. So in a situation where people are engaged in much more diversified economic activities, one person's illness or an adverse impact on one person's household might be able to be supported by an extended community. But the development process, if we look now at countries that are highly highly dependent on fossil fuels imports, on food price imports and so on. You only need one shock to rice prices and it affects whole communities. So then the ability of some people in the community to offset the damage to others is much harder because everybody's been hit. The same in the Pacific, pardon me, with remittance-dependent societies. The remittance is a source of great well-being for people, but it does mean that lots of households are exposed to the same shock at once. And this might be a space where government social safety nets might be able to play more of a role in helping to address some of the shocks that traditional systems aren't designed to deal with just because they affect everybody at the same time.
Can I jump in there too? Because I just think it's that sort of intersection between inequality and insecurity that we're talking. I mean, if you're rich, if you have a lot of money, that money protects you against the hazards of life. You can buy your medical care when you need it. You can tie yourself through a period of low income. It's middle class and poor people that really need the protections from risk pooling, that really need that in insurance. And now, social insurance is the phrase that people use in rich countries to describe workers' compensation and old age pension and public health care and all those things that sort of guard individuals against those risks. But that need for security, that need for some stability in your life, I think it's kind of a universal human need. It just becomes very much tougher for traditional mechanisms to fulfill that when you have urbanization and industrialization and smaller families and the breakdown of traditional mores and a whole bunch of other stresses on those traditional mechanisms. So I think it's a real priority for both inequality and insecurity reasons to develop these mechanisms.
I just add on to why it is really important for the inequality conversation is because it's also it also redistributes income through these traditional systems that are happening, and it's important that we understand how societies do that without any intervention anyway, and it's an important part of understanding inequality as well. So
let's we're talking about solutions now, obviously, but Jeannie, I'll come to you in a moment, but can the traditional system of one talk and I guess the very Western ideal of social welfare, can they live hand in hand, do you think?
Absolutely. And I think, as Jeannie said, I think in a country like Papua New Guinea, which has a lot of economic wealth or is, has a lot of resources, there is no choice but to start thinking about state interventions that redistribute wealth in a more equitable manner in the country. So that has to happen, I think, and that conversation, I don't think it's an easy way because you've got issues to do with how it would be managed, whether there's capacity in the country to manage redistribution of that wealth. How do you target, given it's such a diverse country, you just can't have an umbrella policy. And so in the interim, in the absence of any state-provided social security and insurance, you don't have a choice but that traditional system. And that's what's happening. And so it has to go hand in hand. And also I think where you can identify places where communities or people are supporting others, we've got to find ways to strengthen that mechanism, because at the end of the day it will come down to communities and families and how they work together. They need support.
Yeah. Can I talk about how this has played out in India a little bit? Because we have something called the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which theoretically guarantees everyone a certain minimum number of days, it's about half the year, that's worked at the minimum wage. And that it has been criticized for a variety of reasons, but I think on the whole the experience is actually quite positive, because you have in places, I'm thinking of the so-called hunger belt of eastern Uttar Pradesh, of Bihar, of parts of West Bengal, places that are really have poverty that fortunately doesn't exist on that scale in the Pacific, very fortunately. And we see that these informal networks and so on, it's not that they break down when you have government guarantees coming in, but rather that the whole economics of the place changes a little bit. So people who are basically bonded laborers, or people who are basically working in what we would call slave-like conditions, now they have a certain minimum, it's not a great wage, let's be clear about this, but they have a certain minimum amount of dignity that they're able to get at the beginning, which changes the family patterns, which changes the kind of bargaining power they have for contracts, informal contracts, formal contracts, and so on, marriages and so on, how they happen and so on. And it also changes the labor market a lot. So if you want to employ people, you no longer have access to those basically, tiny, tiny wage workers no longer exist in many parts. But it was a process. It was a process that took several years, first of passing the act, first of the Indian government saying we have enough money to do it, then of passing the act, then of actually implementing. Then we had to get it extended. For example, now women can access it. Before, the theory was, well, if you have one earner in the house who's a man, we said no, the women should also have be able to access this independently, right? So it was a process, it's an evolving process, but I think on the whole it's been quite successful. Brazil has similar stories, South Africa has similar stories, so I think we need to learn from some of these social protection schemes.
Ginny, you mentioned earlier that the World Bank is now working towards improving the wealth and the outcomes for the bottom 40% of people. How is this happening in the Pacific?
In the Pacific, I think it's very important to focus on the things that protect the poor most. And at the core of that is health and education services. So particularly in the last 5-6 years when the Pacific Islands have been very hard hit by the food and fuel crisis, the global financial crisis with its impact on remittances, and then in some countries a series of natural disasters, one of the most important things to do has been to enable the state to protect its funding for health and education, to keep health and education available, reasonable quality, free, so that people can access it. And that has meant helping governments mobilise revenue as well as mobilising grants from development partners so that they're not in a situation where they have to cut core spending in order to meet some kind of fiscal targets. Another area which is beginning to be scaled up a little more in the Pacific Islands is working in social safety nets, so youth unemployed in Port Moresby and in Honiara, providing opportunities for some work, some training, some skills development to make them more employable. And those kind of safety nets are probably going to prove more important if there's a potential to scale them up in future. One of the problems we face in the Pacific Islands is that if there is no safety net existing at a point when there's a crisis, in the face of the crisis, it's not possible to work quickly to develop the information and the systems and the people and the capacity to respond. What you need is something on the ground already that can be scaled up, can be moved, can be adjusted, so that you've already gathered the information you need and can respond more effectively. And then I think the other thing that's very important, which the bank is also focusing on, is investing in agricultural productivity, investing in rural infrastructure and services and so on. Because it's one thing for people to move from rural to urban areas because they have a better opportunity in the urban areas, because they've got some skills and they can get a good job. It's another thing for them to be pushed to move because they don't have access to the services, health services, education services, or any kind of livelihood in rural areas. So what you don't want is people to have to go. You want them to be able to go because it's a benefit to go. So focusing on rural areas is very important because that's where usually the majority of the poor are.
And Lars, before we move on to questions, you touched on the effective taxation of a country's wealth or economic growth. Are there any other solutions that you see in terms of bridging that divide, the inequality?
Well, I think a number of people have already mentioned the crucial importance of that core level of public services in healthcare and education, not just for the inequality of outcome at any point in time, but even more importantly for inequality of opportunity, because those are the services that are particularly important for young children. And maintaining those services at a reasonable level obviously requires tax revenue. If I could get a little magic wand and wave it and have a policy change, I think my personal favorite would be universal old age pensions, because they are hugely important as redistributive devices when people still live in extended family situations. Much of the benefit is shared, very often received indirectly by the grandchildren, particularly the granddaughters in some contexts. And so it has a major impact on society and lessening inequality and poverty, and it has a major impact on affecting people's expectations of the future. So particularly in countries with a relatively young population, the cost is relatively low now, but it also anticipates social problems in the future, because in countries where the dependence is on the family for security in old age face the problem of what do you do when the birth rate starts to fall. What happens to the older generation when there just aren't that many of the younger generation in their own family who can take care of them? So both for the right here and right now, and for the preempting of future social problems, my little magic wand would say a old age pension is a good thing to do.
An excellent final thought before we lead into questions. So let's open up to questions now from Sydney and from the country offices. And while you're thinking of some questions that you have, we've got one from Twitter. This is open to the whole panel. Is it possible to end inequality in Asia? A very big aim. Sameer.
Yeah, it depends how you define. Listen, if we say, is it possible to make everyone, the same, everyone have the same level of income? No, it's probably not possible. It's probably not even desirable, right? Is it possible to narrow the gap between the very wealthy and everyone else? Absolutely, it's possible. And it's not rocket science, right? We have the examples that I give, I'll give them and people will say, well, how relevant is that to the Asia or the Pacific context? But I think, human nature is the same everywhere. These same bags of policies can work. So if we look at post-war Europe, if we look at Northern Europe, you have development, or even if you look at countries like Denmark today, or which is, by the way, rated one of the happiest countries according to an index that's favored by the government of Bhutan, which is the Global Happiness Index. So, if you look at those countries, what you have is, yes, you have entrepreneurs, yes, you have wealthy people and so on, and they're quite happy, but they're also paying 40, 45, 50, sometimes 60% tax, right? And that tax is all going back into social services. And I think, if we study those societies, I think we say, okay, these are in terms of trying to get back to some of the ethical systems that we see in some of our traditional indigenous people systems and Aboriginal systems and so on, which I think are much more human than the way that a lot of our societies work. I think these are trying to, through the mechanism of a massive state, and it looks very different. But at the heart, the ethics of such a system where no one is left behind and no one is allowed to go too far ahead is very similar to these kind of more egalitarian societies that we all come from.
We've got a... Sorry,
I'd
Lars.
just like to remind everybody that going way back, people noticed that Taiwan and Korea were places where there was land reform and significant improvements in inequality, and that was very positive for their long-run growth and development. So it's not like there's some sort of enormous trade-off between equality and growth. In fact, the more efficient sorts of societies are those that invest very heavily in the capabilities of all their citizens, in the education and the skills of everybody. And so then that creates much more productive societies and much higher growth rates going off into the indefinite future. So the development in countries like Korea and Taiwan over the last 50 years is phenomenal. But they started from a relative level of greater equality than many other countries in the region.
I've got another question here, this time from Port Moresby. So I might direct this to you, Michelle. How do you define poverty? In PNG, rural people don't go hungry because they have land. Is it correct to say that poverty is an urban issue that only affects people who are alienated from their traditional lands?
Yeah, good question. I think poverty has always been a contentious word in the Papua New Guinean context because of, I think, access to land and traditional systems. So it's an uncomfortable word. People don't want to talk about poverty and say there's no poverty in Papua New Guinea. I think that poverty is a broader issue than just income and food. Yeah, it's also about opportunities and access to social services and markets and so if you look at it in that broader context, I think we have to admit that there is a certain element of poverty in Papua New Guinea, yeah, and increasing inequality. Also, just looking at issues such as gender-based violence, which creates marginal people within households or very vulnerable situations. So when you look at poverty in a broader type of with a broader lens, I think that there is poverty in Papua New Guinea and increasing inequality. Also, by far, the largest number of poor people in Papua New Guinea are based in rural areas, and some of them are very, very isolated and disadvantaged. And So therefore, I wouldn't say that it's just an urban phenomena. There is increasing urban poverty because of cost of living in urban centres and dependency on cash. But I think in Papua New Guinea's case, by far the highest number of poor people in Papua New Guinea live in rural areas. Yes, they have access to land, they have access to agricultural food base and land for shelter, but in terms of access to the facilities like health and education that we should all be expecting in a society, we should all have some fair access and equitable access. I think that there are significant pockets in Papua New Guinean society that are quite disadvantaged.
Ginny, we've got a question for you from Solomon Islands. You said that the kind of poverty found in Southeast Asia doesn't necessarily apply to Pacific Island countries, and that what the Pacific has is hardship. How does the World Bank define or measure that hardship, and what are the implications of the new poverty targets?
The data that we have on hardship in the Pacific is country data. It's not so much our data. It's data that the countries have gathered themselves, perhaps with our help, perhaps with help from other regional organisations. And poverty is defined, or hardship is defined differently depending on the country. So food poverty, we already said, is quite low. But hardship itself tends to be defined more in a basket of basic needs, that people have access to water, sanitation, transport, the sort of really essential elements of their life. And it's defined in different ways in the different countries. It's defined on a relative basis. So the figures aren't directly comparable, but that's how it's measured. It's country determined rather than our determination. But what you can then see from that is the trends in how households are and are more likely to be living in hardship. So households where the household head or the adults in the household don't have access to jobs, far more likely to be living in hardship. Households where the head is elderly, far more likely to be living in hardship. Large numbers of children, more likely to be living in hardship. And where the household adults have only had access to primary school education, again, more likely to live in hardship. So you can see these trends, and that helps you sort of be able to identify where the vulnerabilities are for people living in hardship. And I think the other thing that's true in the Pacific Islands is wherever you draw the line, you can define people who are and aren't in hardship or poverty, but there are a large number of people who are sitting just above it. So they are very vulnerable to fall into hardship in the event of perhaps even a small shock to food prices, fuel prices, their cash crop that's important, or remittances, that they're really only just above the line. So, you're looking at the people who are technically defined as being in hardship, but also those who may well be in hardship next year, depending on the shocks that the Pacific Islands might face.
Thanks, Ginny. Is there a question from Sydney?
So there wasn't any mention of corruption in kind of these aid programs. How significant is the problem of corruption, and is there maybe a link between low levels of corruption and success in these advocacy programs?
My take is an unconventional take, which is that absolutely that corruption is a problem. I don't deny it, and everyone's against corruption. Easy thing to say. Everyone's against murder. Everyone's against corruption, right? Fairly easy. But that said, I think if we look at history, if we look at some of the development stories, they almost all, think of the era of the robber barons in the United States, right? Think of even Thatcherism, the kind of privatization that Thatcher did, or the privatization that happened at the time of Mexico and Carlos Slim in the 1980s and so on, right? So, which was, in retrospect, was a time of great GDP growth, but not equitable, right? So, I think the development stories, if you analyze them, they all involve a relationship between domestic private sector and government, okay? And sometimes that relationship is going to be corrupt, right? And I think a certain level of corruption, as long as it's between those two players, can be okay. The problem is when you have other players coming in, when you have international players coming in, because then it's not about jobs created here, right? It's not about the country. It suddenly becomes about jobs created jobs created in Australia, or jobs created in the US, or in the West, or whatever it may be, right? It becomes those national interests competing with your national interests, right? So my point is not that everyone needs to be corrupt. Absolutely not. My point is that by focusing on corruption, we may be asking the wrong sets of questions. And what we should be asking is, what is your development strategy? How is it going to create growth if growth needs to be created? How is that growth going to be equitable? And how are we going to move? It's not, if we take a human rights lens, it's not the case that all human rights, the rights to, even the right to food, the right to clean water, the right to employment and so on, it's not the case that the government has the responsibility to deliver on all of those rights tomorrow if they're not being delivered today. It is the case that the government has to move towards what we call progressive realization of all of those rights. So show me how you're going to do that. And yes, there will be mistakes. Everyone's going to make mistakes. There may be some corruption and so on. If there is, please deal with it, have legal redress and so on. The problem is when the corruption, as in many of our states, when the corruption is the defining ethos, is the defining element, when the distinction between the private sector and the government is not there, is drawn, it becomes one and the same. Then that becomes really problematic. And I think if we look, for example, even in India, we say, okay, now we have the case when all of or even the United States, for that matter, where both of the ruling parties effectively are making policies in the interests of the top 1% or the top 5%. Now that is extremely unhealthy, right? So the question is, how do we balance these things in the context of a development strategy?
Lars and then
just to interject as well, we also have to remember that conceptions of cronyism and corruption are culturally specific and change over time. I mean, at one time it was perfectly normal for the British Navy and the British Army to sell commissions for officerships. It was just the way things were done. We would think of that today as quite corrupt. So that if you by today's standards of corruption, countries like Canada, the U.S., the U.K. were hugely rotten 100 years ago. So things change over time, and we have to be a little bit careful about taking today's definition of corruption from a subset of the world's population and saying that that's appropriate at all stages and all times. I mean, I'm not going to make an argument for corruption, but I am going to make an argument against cultural hegemony.
Your question's like a gold nugget for me. I think in Papua New Guinea's case, because that's where I'm most familiar, I think corruption is a really serious issue, and it's particularly serious when it's money that's being siphoned away from education or from health or social services and simply being funneled out of the system towards very few people. And I think that's a serious case, perhaps all over the Pacific, but I can say for Papua New Guinea, we've had a few scandals in the past few years that have involved funds that were allocated for education and health that simply just disappeared. And it's really hard to account for it, and which comes back to when we're addressing these issues, the importance of also working with governance institutions of financial accountability and the legal frameworks to keep on strengthening them so that they're always in a position to work. If they don't function, you are going to have corruption. The other aspect of this is working with civil society and communities to give people voices to hold leaders accountable. At the end of the day, if you're going to reduce corruption, leaders need to be held accountable from within, and that's another aspect I think that's important to address.
Is there another question from Sydney?
My name is Satyapur from University of Western Sydney. As has been pointed out right from the beginning, that the inequality is bad for growth and development. That's true. But inequality could be bearable in a country if the country is very rich. Very rich country where basic minimum requirements are met. If inequality is there, that may not be as bad as in a developing country where there is poverty. So basically, where there is a low income, where there are low incomes or low GDP, where there inequality is bad. Inequality leads to social deprivation, crimes and everything. My question is, what is the role of the World Bank or any other NGO to reduce the inequality in the developing countries in particular? apart from whatever they are doing, whatever steps the developing countries are taking. For example, India is doing very well in terms of growth, but the growth is now coming back to the Hindu growth rate of 4%. So what is the role of the World Bank here so that India could sustain? If India sustains, India could become a model for rest of the South Asian developing countries. So this is the question I'm curious to know.
So the question is, I guess, not just the World Bank, but other institutions, what's their role in helping to reduce this inequality? Does anyone have any thoughts?
Well, the World Bank in particular has changed over time. One country I'm particularly familiar with is Tanzania, where at one point it was the Washington Consensus that you should have a market mechanism in education and primary schools should charge fees. Well, under the Nyerere regime, there was a 96% primary school attendance. Torpedoed, it went way down. So you had a lost generation, courtesy of the Washington Consensus and the World Bank. In the 1990s, that policy switched around, and now it's a major imperative from the World Bank.
Due to some of us, campaigning a lot in front of World Bank headquarters.
Well, I mean, I don't know what goes on inside the World Bank, but
outside.
But in any event, suddenly it's now a good thing to have primary school and the secondary education without fees, and so the enrollment rate has gone way up, and that's hugely more positive. So one of the problems, of course, is that these countries are at the mercy of decisions and switching fashions and tides of opinion far away, and that's a huge problem for many of the very poorest countries.
I would have said that there's a very important role to play in helping to redress inequality. If people don't have the ability to make the best of their own labour assets, of their own capabilities, then that's bad for them. It's bad for social inclusion, it's bad for development outcomes for those marginalised people. It's also bad for the society in general because they're not making the best of the assets they have. And so I guess this is where it comes from, this discussion about having fee-free access to basic health and education services so that everybody has the opportunity to participate in building human capital. And this is where the kind of growth inequality debate comes from, that you could say if poorer families can't afford their school fees, oh well, we'll wait for more economic growth over the next generation to raise the standard of living of those families so they will be able to afford school fees in a generation. But why would you sit back and say, well, we'll just wait for growth to deal with this, when you could have the state provide basic health and education for people? So I think that
thereby create growth.
And thereby create growth. So I think that's, there is a positive role to play, and it's important, for everybody to sort of collaborate in that, not the bank, not just the fund, but the governments themselves and also NGOs and so on, bilateral donors and so on. And I don't think we should understate the role that the developing country governments play themselves, because it is somewhat insulting to developing country governments to see it as if they are not a player in this game and that their policies are not under their control as well. They ought to have that scope and that ownership and not just be a matter of what's debated somewhere else around a different table.
Okay, we're fast running out of time, so for these last few questions, I might just ask one of the panellists to answer them. We've got a question here from Timor-Leste. Inequality is a major issue globally. The global financial crisis shows how it's threatened democracies across the developed world. What steps can be taken to help fragile state countries, young countries such as Myanmar and Timor-Leste?
I'm less familiar with the case of Timor-Leste, but I have spent some time in Myanmar recently, and I think that there's a government that's really trying to wrestle with, if you're entering if you're entering the community of nations now, or if you're talking about these projects now, you have a lot of history from which to draw. And I think what the government of Myanmar is doing, and I hope what the government of Timor-Leste will be doing, is looking at the good examples and the bad examples and trying to learn the lessons. And I think if you do that, I think you'll find two things. One is to address the previous comments. Development works when you have citizens and communities engaging with government in order to craft that policy. Now, in some contexts we call this democracy, although it has nothing to do with voting, right? In other contexts, we just call it, government, good government, right? So that's one set of examples is around sort of what works and how communities should be at the center. There's another set of examples in terms of economic transformation, that movement away from agriculture, away from raw materials in general, towards finished goods of some kind or another. I mean, every single developed country has done this. It's not something new. You know, this is a debate that was being had between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton in 1799, right? So there's not much new that we're debating here. It's just that now we have a whole lot more history from which to draw. And I think if we do that, we find putting jobs at the center and putting economic transformation at the center is really the key. Whether you're a new country or you've been around a little bit, the lessons are the same.
Thanks, Sameer. Do we have a question from Sydney? Ma'am.
Thank you. My question goes to Sameer. You know very well that some of the major issues on causing inequality is tax burden, which in most cases rests on the most poor people. In your view, what can be done to reduce tax from big companies resting on the most poor people, especially on most basic needs that they have to acquire?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I mean, we did a study, ActionAid did a study a couple of years ago where we looked at a big multinational brewing company called SAB Miller. And this is a brewing company that owns both of the major breweries in Ghana. And we did this study and we found that the company was essentially paying no tax in Ghana for all intents and purposes. And then we looked at the case of one woman who was selling, in fact, she was selling the same beer to the workers in the factory. And so she's an informal kind of a shop. And we sort of did the calculation, okay, how much is this woman paying in direct and indirect taxes? And I found out she's paying much more than this big multinational company is paying. So your question about the tax burden shifting to the poor is absolutely right. I think the solution is go after that 300 billion that corporations are not paying. And of course, one piece of that, one very crucial piece of that we haven't had time to discuss here, is really this question of tax havens and these kind of agreements between countries in Africa that often date back to even colonial periods or soon after the colonial period, where countries have tax agreements, have dual taxation agreements with secret jurisdictions, Mauritius being a very common one, but there are others as well. So the point is that there's certain things that have to change in international law for us to do this, right? And the plus side, the positive thing is that there actually is some political will behind this. The G20 has come out in favor of some of these proposals. And we're hoping that the Australian government, which is hosting the G20 for next year's summit in Brisbane, we're hoping the Australian government will also be a strong proponent of these, getting rid of these tax havens, of having some fair tax policies in the international arena.
Thanks, Sameer. And we've got time for just one last question. Is there anyone in Sydney who'd like to ask that?
Actually, my name is Charles. I actually wanted to follow up on what she asked. Can you really tax what you don't see? Because some of these corporations actually hire very savvy accountants to basically conceal information. And I also wanted to follow up on the issue of sub-Saharan Africa in light of Exim Bank compared to World Bank. How relevant is World Bank going forward, looking at how Exim Bank is taking over all the services that, in quotes, World Bank used to do?
In some cases, you do see it. And if you think, for example, of gold mining or oil production or coal or a lot of these basic resources, the output is in fact measured, and there are world prices. In some cases, these are listed companies on stock exchanges, so they have to have some public record of their costs. So there is some basis for knowing that yes, there are large profits being made. You can compare those profits with the size of the locally raised taxation, and what you often find is that there's very, very little out of this being taxes that are being paid locally. That doesn't mean that taxes aren't being paid. They're remitted to the US or the Canada or the UK, and then corporate income tax applies in those jurisdictions, and is often, at least in the Canadian case, often much greater than the foreign aid flows that come back the other way. But it is possible, I think, and I think highly desirable, to provide some benefits for the local population of the exploitation of those natural resources, and you can count it.
I think the question is a good one, particularly in relation to the Pacific Islands, from the point of view that the capacity in tax revenue authorities to be able to accurately assess compliance and to be able to devote resources to tax audits and so on is a big challenge. And that's something that a number of developing countries in the Pacific and a number of development partners are trying to address, and perhaps an area where regional cooperation can be particularly useful in the Pacific. It may not be possible to have a specialist in extractive industry royalty arrangements in any one Pacific Island country, but there might be scope to have a specialist who can serve a number of governments and so on to try and increase the capacity, because it's very complex, as you say, it's very difficult. And the governments need to have the capacity to make sure that they draft appropriate legislation and that they're able to enforce compliance with it, so that the public can have a fair share of the revenue from economic activity, whatever the sector, and can then share it around the country with the population generally through public expenditure.
Let's just, I'm sorry, Sameer, but let's just wrap this discussion up. We could go on forever, I'm sure. But before we do close it officially, are there some final thoughts, some brief final thoughts from each of our panellists about this very broad issue of poverty and inequality? Michelle?
Kick off. Well, we talked about why we need to talk about inequality and development. I just sort of thought and someone asked the question about whether we can reduce it or not, which is probably an impossible thing to do given the way the world is, but I don't think we can't not talk about it, yeah? And you basically can't achieve development unless you talk about inequality. That's for me the bottom line. And if you don't address inequality, you actually undermine your efforts at development. So that's my closing statement.
Thanks.
I think here in 2013, we're really entering a new paradigm. It's not possible to just talk about absolute poverty. It's just not acceptable in this day and age. It's not possible to just talk about median minimum standards of something. If you have 1% of the world's population controlling 40% of the world's wealth, 10% of the world's population controlling 80% of the world's wealth, well, that's 90% of the world's people who are trying to make do, trying to barely subsist with the 20% that's available, right? And I think even just in political terms, this is going to explode. We see some explosions, and the explosions are coming in unlikely places. They're coming in the US, they've come in Turkey, they've come in Brazil. They will continue to come until we come up with some global answers to have justice, to have economic justice, to have tax justice, to ensure that, by all means, people can make profits. We haven't talked about the environmental, the limits to planetary boundaries and the environmental aspect of all this and global warming, but that's another piece of this puzzle as well. So until we need a new paradigm, we need a new framework for addressing these things, and the center point of that framework must be the need for a more equitable, a more economic system that leads to greater equality and not greater inequality.
I think it's very important for us to focus on what is happening to the poorest in society, both the absolute poor and sort of poorest 40%, and focus on that inequality and poverty. But I don't think in doing so, and in looking at how growth is actually shared among people, we don't want to lose sight of the bigger picture of why we're here, which is really the inequality between countries. So I just think we don't want to narrow so much in thinking about inequality that we're looking only within the country prism. We also need to be thinking between countries that's what development is really about.
Thanks, Jenny.
I'd like to emphasize that there are some countries where inequality and poverty has been decreasing in the last while, and that's the Latin American countries, where you've seen, albeit starting from very high levels of poverty and inequality, but you've seen very significant declines, in part in terms of money income, but of course poverty and inequality isn't just about money income, it's also about the services in healthcare and education that also go into human development, and partly through increased financial transfers, partly through expenditures in healthcare and education. Outcomes in the Latin American countries in terms of poverty and inequality improved significantly. And that's partly come from a shift in national resources, and it's partly also come from social decision-making, i.e. political decision-making. So to come back to the point, can we do something about poverty and inequality? I think the answer is yes, we can, and it has been done, and is being done in some parts of the world.
Thank you, Lars. And that brings us to the end of our discussion. And can we also please thank our panellists, Michelle Rooney, Sameer Dossani, Virginia Horscroft, and Lars Osberg. I'd also like to thank everyone joining us either here in Sydney or from afar. And remember, you can view this or any of our other Praxis discussions at worldbank.org/Praxis. Until next time, I'm Auskar Surbakti. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.